Hello, my friends. Today we're going to talk about people pleasing and why it's a problem, not just for us as individuals, but for us as a society, for humanity as a whole. And this conversation is more of a sociological, philosophical sort of take on why shifting away from people pleasing into more self-loving, empowered way of approach on the individual level is actually going to be healthier for us as a whole, for humanity as a whole. My partner Sarah and I just finished leading a workshop called Rockin' the Boat last night, how to dismantle the habit of people pleasing, and I'm feeling super inspired. I want to have a more broad conversation about this topic. So we're not going to go super into the nitty gritty of what people pleasing does to the individual. Maybe we'll kind of touch on it, but more this is about like why should we as a whole stop people pleasing each other and start taking better care of ourselves as individuals. To throw out sort of a general definition of people pleasing, and there's so many different flavors and manifestations of people pleasing that show up in our lives, and we all do it. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not good or bad. In general, though, it takes away from our health and our happiness and is draining and exhausting. So I don't want anybody to walk away feeling ashamed that they people please, because I people please, you people please. We all do it in some way or another, and it's okay. And it's very understandable because we are social creatures and our conditioning has naturally led to this habit showing up in our lives. But before I get to why, the definition, anytime we're giving from a place of lack or insecurity or trying to control for what we want and try to avoid what we don't want, we're people pleasing. So typically, people pleasing happens in order to get the validation of others, to stay in the good graces of others, and to avoid discomfort, avoid the reactivity of others, to avoid being kicked out of the group. In some way, shape, or form, we're trying to control to stay in the collective as a positive contributor. And this makes sense because we are social beings. And so coming back to evolutionary perspective on the plains, we worked a lot better in numbers. And this is true today. We work a lot better in numbers. But so the survival instinct, in order to keep us in the group so we're not roaming around on the plains, vulnerable to the tiger or the lion on our own, if we stay in the group, we're more likely to survive. And so this very primitive instinct has sort of leached into the way that we relate to our culture in this day and age by trying to keep ourselves in the good graces of others as a survival instinct, trying to avoid being disliked or ultimately ostracized from the group. And a lot of things in our culture perpetuate this, and also our relationship to money and achievement and titles are all similar manifestations to this desire to stay a part of the group. And so people pleasing is just another sort of aspect of that is intertwined. And so, again, ultimately we're trying to control other people to look at us in a positive light. Because if they were not to look at us in a positive light, we would be unsafe. So it makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. And again, we all do this in some way, shape, or form in little ways every day, from, laughing along at jokes that suck with your coworkers, to big ways in our relationships where we just completely appease and deny what we want in order to avoid pissing off our partner and feeling ultimately the discomfort, the hard emotions that we might feel as a result of that. So this is an issue because people pleasing is draining. It's exhausting. When you get down to the nuts and bolts of it, when you give from an empty cup, it's unsustainable. And often we prioritize the other's wants and needs as our source of validation rather than our own wants and needs and our own energy. And so we're trading our energy and our authenticity and our happiness to make sure that another is looking at us in a positive light. And so what's happening is we're externalizing our sense of self to the social world around us. Similar to that money achievement label culture where we think that all of these things outside of us, if we rack up enough dollar bills, if we get that promotion, everyone will think we're fucking awesome and we'll be safe, we'll be good, and life will be merry and honky-dory. But we sell ourselves short in that process and in that habit and that pattern. So when we're people-pleasing, we're reaffirming this framework of belief that our worthiness, our value is determined by something, in this case, someone outside of ourselves. And it's a tough habit to shake. And yet it is so important for us to shake and shift out of as a culture if we want to really, truly work together and collaborate. I have a lot of friends who are beautiful human beings, giving, generous human beings who are in, PhD programs to become, therapists to give back into the world, and yet it blows my mind how little they are taught to care for themselves in these caregiving professions, and how exhausted and drained they are in the process of learning to equip themselves to be able to give to another. And so there's this theme where we skip a part. We skip a huge part of the equation where, we're lovers, at our cores, we want to give. It feels fucking great to give. And so the generosity that we have is often mixed up in people pleasing because we skip the part of giving to ourselves. And this is just so unsustainable because, again, it's exhausting, it's draining, you're neglecting yourself. And so I think that there's this common theme in our culture where we're giving to others before we're giving to ourselves. And so the problem with that is that we will burn out inevitably. And the expansive possibilities of creative thinking are really snubbed by the exhaustion of denying ourselves. So our true collaborative spirit, our highest level cognitive thinking and innovation, and ability to give in the most energetically impactful way are all limited by this attitude of giving before giving to ourselves. When we give from an empty cup, we don't have much to give. And so we're really limited in our ability to make the world a better place, because if the impact that we're trying to make is from an inner world that is exhausted and drained, we're not going to get very far. We're not really going to make as wonderful an impact as maybe our intentions are, because we've skipped the part where we need to care for ourselves. There's this story that I love to come back to about the Dalai Lama, who is the highest, most revered voice in the Tibetan lineage of Buddhism, and maybe the most important voice coming out of the Eastern world in terms of bringing wisdom practices into the West and into the rest of the world. He is a, advocate, proponent for peace and health and happiness on the individual and on the cultural level. Brilliant man. And he collaborates with Western scientists and meditation teachers frequently in order to help, bridge the gap between the wisdom of Eastern spirituality and practices and the Western world. And there's this awesome story of a meeting where teachers were talking with him and trying to learn from him. And they said, like, hey, what about the self-loathing and the self-hatred in the West? And the Dalai Lama was confused. He, is a brilliant man, like very well-versed in scientific reasoning, as well as, the insight that he has developed as a lifelong meditator in the Tibetan lineage. And yet he was confused. He was like, what are you talking about? He's like talking with his translator, trying to figure out what are they talking about? Self-hatred? What is this? And finally, the conclusion was reached that there is no word for self-hatred in the Tibetan language because it doesn't exist. It's such a foreign concept to them in their world and in their practice and in their culture. And what that highlights is that we have a unique problem here in the West, which is a much more individualistic culture where we tend to fucking hate ourselves. And maybe that's the extreme version of it, but we're not taught to love ourselves. We're not taught to care for ourselves. There's this concept of selfishness that's really shoves our wants and our needs back down, because again, we're looking outside of ourselves for the validation, for the safety. We're trained in our school system in preparing ourselves for the workforce to get good grades, to get the good job, to get the promotion, to make money. We're looking for our validation. We're looking for our safety outside of ourselves. And we're denying inside of ourselves what is needed. So we have this unique problem here in the West, and that's not that it doesn't, exist in other parts of the world. And as other parts of the world are being westernized, having lived in Vietnam for 3 years, I see this problem creeping into their culture, which is much more collective and grounded as a community in a way that isn't denying the self. And there's differences all over the world. So, I'm speaking in black and whites, but I'm speaking, I think, to a Western audience right now. And so, yeah, this problem of skipping over ourselves and either working hard to earn the money to feel good about ourselves, or this other path of giving generously without giving to ourselves to feel fulfilled. They're all flawed in their reasoning, and they're all limiting in their capacity to make truly positive and sustainable change. We're limiting ourselves as human beings. So my argument here is that as a culture, we need to stop people pleasing. And what I'm saying is that I think the resistance to shifting gears from people pleasing is this selfishness card where we think like, oh, but that's selfish to focus on myself. It's selfish to think about what I want and need. And many of us are like conditioned very deeply to that belief. And yet, as I said, it's limiting. It's unsustainable. It's exhausting. We're neglecting ourselves. And in effect, we're neglecting a positive contribution to the world around us that is made by a truly energized, loving presence. If we don't fill our cups up as individuals, how can we really, truly contribute to the world around us? How can we, from a place of wholeness, of love, of energy, contribute to the world around us for more than a short period of time if we are exhausted and overwhelmed and neglecting ourselves? We can't. And so if we are just a world of givers without giving to ourselves, we're going to burn out. And, in a lot of ways, we are burning out right now in the world. Literally, the world is burning out. And I truly believe and feel into the reality that in order to love the world around you, the doorway is through yourself. So it's not selfish, it's actually selfless to give to yourself, because very naturally you will find, if you choose to lean into this work and these shifts out of externalizing our sense of self into cultivating it within yourself, you will find that when you love yourself, love for the world around you comes more naturally, because they're one and the same. When you have a full cup, there's nothing else to do but to share it with others, to spill over into the world around you. And so what I want to suggest ultimately is that we got to shift this idea of taking care of ourselves, of loving ourselves, of doing this inner work and making choices that are truly for ourselves rather than for other people always, as not something that's selfish, but selfless. Because when we give to ourselves, we're giving to the collective. When we give to ourselves, we can give more truly and energetically and innovatively to the world around us. When we are skipping that part, when we give too quickly to others and deny ourselves, we risk and ultimately do burn out. A lot of people chase for good portions of their life, looking for the career validation, the social validation, and then they get exhausted and they realize, oh my God, there's so many flaws in this system. And the hope is that you'll realize that early on or now and recognize that this is unsustainable to just look for our sense of worth in labels and titles and other people's opinions of us. It doesn't last. The only thing that is coming with you everywhere you go is you. Circumstances change, people come and go. You lose jobs, you gain jobs. Life around us is constantly changing. So if we're putting all of our eggs in that basket, well, we're going to get thrown around in life and eventually crash and burn. If we can put the power back into our own hands, into our own hearts, well, we can take that with us wherever we go. We become versatile and resilient and unstoppable because the love is cultivated from within. It doesn't depend on what other people think. Your voice is the only voice that truly matters, not mine, not your boss's. You know better than anybody. You should know better than anybody your truth and your value. And it takes work to shift that perception. It takes work to shift your storylines, and it takes action. It takes action and belief, which reaffirm one another. So the individual work is something that takes time, but again, the hope here, the encouragement is to say, like, we need to do this as a society. Everybody needs to do this as an individual, because as a society, if we want to survive, if we want to fucking thrive, and we can thrive, like, not just get through the issues at hand that are, tanking our species and other species, but in order to get through that, solve those problems, and then shift gears into a world that's actually just fucking on it and thriving and full of love and energy and collaborative and innovative and growing, we have to stop people pleasing as a culture. So to take stock with this conversation, ask yourself, how does people pleasing show up in my life? What is my relationship with the idea of taking more care of myself? Does that feel selfish to me? Why does that feel selfish to me? Who gave me the idea that taking care of myself to advocate for my wants and my needs is selfish? Where did that come from? Is that belief something that I want to maintain? How willing are you to lean into this possibility that actually taking care of myself is a selfless thing, because it leads to more generosity and loving, not just inward, but outward as well? So I invite you to reflect on these concepts in your own life. And if you want to learn how to people please less, how to build a sense of worth from inside yourself, how to learn to love yourself more intrinsically, please reach out, because I would love to support you on that. I would love to point you in the right direction, or perhaps help you one-on-one as your coach, as your guide. I'm here to support just in putting the ideas out there, and maybe that's enough. If you want more, holler, and maybe we can work together. Lots of love. Let's do this. We are doing this. We doing it. Have a dope day.